Hi, this is Ewan Smith for AE Tuts with a quick tip which will help you create natural looking motion which decays over time without using any keyframes, just using a simple expression. Let's get started. Create a new composition, we'll call it text, and that's a 10-second composition, 25 frames a second, and it's 720p. First thing we need to do is create some text. I'm using a font called Cheeseburger, which I downloaded for free off DaFont. And we'll say Jello. And let's center that. Okay, that's our text. Let's create a bit more space. Turn off the grid. I want to make this text look a bit more interesting, add a bit of shine so it actually looks like Jello. And so first stage is to take this layer and duplicate it. So that's Control D or Apple D. And I'm going to call this dark. We'll create a dark core inside of the lettering to give it a bit of dimension. Take your blending mode, change it to multiply, go to Effect, Matte, Simple Choker, and we'll use this to bring in the edges a little, say 40 pixels. And then to make that a bit more subtle, go to Blur, Fast Blur, add a 10 pixel blur. That should soften it up. And it's a little bit too dark, so if you hit T on the keyboard, bring up your opacity, and let's drop that to 50%. We also need to add a little bit of shine. So I'm going to create a new solid. Doesn't matter what color. Then add a ramp. So generate ramp. And what we want to do is create some shine here, going from bright at the top to dark at the bottom. So we need to swap these colors around. Change your white to black. And change your black to white. And just to brighten things up a bit, we'll move the top point down so it's a little bit brighter. Let's rename this to ramp and set the blending mode to screen. Now select your pen tool and just create a kind of random curved line that cuts through the lettering. This will be our shine at the top. Complete the mask. And obviously we have some extra around the top here. We want to get rid of that. So take your initial text layer, duplicate it again, rename that to mask, and bring it up above your ramp layer and set the track matte to alpha. So we now have a bright top. And it's obviously a little bit too bright. So we'll go to ramp again, hit T on your keyboard, bring the opacity down to say 35%. And if you select your mask and apply another simple choker, and maybe 20 pixels, that gives us a fairly good looking shiny effect. Just to finish that off, if you go to your original layer, go down to the perspective effect and bevel alpha. Let's change that to 0 so the light's coming from the top. Make the edge thickness about 5 and bring the light intensity down to 0.2. So that's our lettering. Now we have to animate it. Create another new composition. And let's call this one animation. Same settings as before. OK that. And bring your text comp into this comp. Let's create a background for this. So again, new solid. Color doesn't matter. Bring that to the bottom, call it background. And we'll apply a ramp to this as well. Generate ramp. And let's go for kind of bright yellow at the top. Something darker, kind of orangey at the bottom. And change that to a radial ramp. Just to make the text stand out a bit, you can apply a drop shadow effect. Move the distance up a bit, say 40 pixels. Again, light coming from the top. Maybe that's a bit too dark. And let's soften up a bit as well. Next stage is to apply the actual animation, and we're going to do this with an expression. So if you select your text layer and go to Effect, Distort, Warp down at the bottom. So that's probably going off your screen there, but warp right at the bottom. Now the default warp isn't really what we're after here, so if you change the warp style from arc to wave and drop the bend to 0 for now. The first thing we need to do is to set the maximum amount of distortion that we're going to play with in this animation. So the maximum you can do is 100, so let's do that. 100 on horizontal, 100 on vertical. So that's the most distorted this will ever get. And now we want to add an expression to animate that distortion. So Alt or Option click the stopwatch on horizontal distortion. And that gives us some space to write an expression. The first thing we want to do is create a variable to hold the warp amount. So we'll call it warp equals, select your pick whip and drag that onto horizontal distortion. Just saves you typing it. The next value we need is a value for decay. This is how quickly the effect will die away from maximum to minimum. This is a value between 0 and 1. The closer the value is to 0, the faster the decay happens. The closer the value is to 1, the longer it takes to die away. So if we choose 0.9, it's going to take a long time to die away, and that's the kind of effect we're after here. We've already set our start point, which is 100, and we want to die away to an end point, so let's call it end, and we'll call that 0, so no distortion at all. Now this is a time and frame based effect, so we need to know the actual length of a frame in this comp. Now we do that with a value called duration, and we set it equal to this comp dot frame duration. As we go through this expression, it'll become important to know what frame in the comp we're actually on. So we have to create a value for that as well. So current equals time, which is the time in the comp in seconds, divided by duration, which we've just set. That will give us the actual frame we're on, but we actually need it to be a whole number. This will give us some fractions, so we need to actually round this up. So math.round will give us a rounded number, parentheses, and close parentheses after. And we also need a holder for the amount of distortion we're applying. We'll set that to 0 for now. Let me just make a bit more space, we're going to need it. Now we have a problem here because expressions are stateless. That means they only care about what's happening right at this second. So if we're creating an animation which builds over time, depending on what happened the frame before, we have a problem. We're going to create a loop and loop through every frame of the movie up to and including the current frame and use that to build our value. So you create a loop by using this command, for. And then we have to create a variable so that we have a counter that runs through our loop. We'll call it f for frame, and we'll start at frame 1 of our movie. F equals 1, semicolon, f is less than or equal to the current frame, which we've already just worked out. And then we're going to go through the frames one at a time. So we have f plus plus. Plus plus in computer terms just adds 1. Then let's open a curly brace. Now we have to work out the values as they build from frame 1 of our movie. So I'm going to create a new variable. I'm going to call it difference. I'm going to set it equal to warp, which is the value we set right at the very start, minus our end value. So in other words, it's looking at the current value of warp and it's seeing the difference between that value and the one we want to end up on, which is 0 in this case. Semicolon. And now amount equals amount minus difference. So itself minus the difference we've just set. And then we multiply that by the value we set for decay. Semicolon. And then we take that value and we add it to the value for warp. Now close the curly braces. So everything between that pair of curly braces will be repeated in a loop from frame 1 to the current frame, adjusting the value as it goes. So we get our accurate value for the bounce. And then we just have to output that final value as the end of our expression. Now if I click through the timeline here, and if you watch this value, you'll see that it's going back and forwards between positive and negative numbers as it's applying a gradually decreasing bounce. But we don't want to just have the bounce happening in the horizontal direction, we also want it to happen in the vertical direction as well. So if you copy your expression, just a Control-C or Apple-C, Option click the stopwatch on vertical distortion and paste in the new expression. So you can see it there. Now the one thing we have to change, because it's set to the horizontal distortion here, is to remove that and pick whip to vertical distortion. And if I create a quick RAM preview, and of course this expression doesn't just apply to the warp effect, basically all it's doing is outputting a number. And if you can use a number to control something in After Effects, then you can apply this expression to it as well. The world is your ostrich. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you find it useful, and I'll see you again.